The main question is, will the conflict expand across the region? Which at present, it is a war of words across the region, but it hasn't escalated significantly in military terms.
Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. This is our 7th episode, and the focus is on events in Israel, Gaza, and the risks of regional escalation in the Middle East. I'm your host, David Benyon, and my guest is Elizabeth Stevens, Managing Director of Geopolitical Risk Advisory. This episode was recorded in late October, just before the beginning of ground operations in Gaza by the Israeli Defence Force. Since then, the war has already escalated in some ways, in terms of the death toll, the bombs dropped on Gaza, the start of urban ground warfare, and the worsening humanitarian situation for Palestinian civilians trying to flee as refugees. Thankfully, we haven't yet seen regional escalation, but fresh flashpoints as potential triggers are occurring almost daily. Skirmishes have intensified on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, with Iranian-backed Hezbollah militia. And an American warship has already shot down several missiles fired from Yemen towards Israel by Iran's Yemeni proxy, the Houthis. And the Houthis have also downed a US drone in return. So the threat of regional escalation is worryingly real. Elizabeth, firstly, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
So please could you just provide a little bit of an introductory explainer of the services that you provide to corporate clients?
We provide companies with information on how to manage and mitigate geopolitical risk. That might be for a single situation investment or across a portfolio of assets. A number of our clients work in dozens, if not more than 100 countries. Now, as well as having qualitative expertise, we also have our own in-house proprietary risk rating model. Now, this model divides the world up into 1,500 regions, and we provide historical data, current data, and forecast data of how political stability and instability will evolve and manifest over those 1,500 regions of the world. It's a big data model. It's coded in Python, and now we have about 175 million data points feeding into that. The reason for the big data approach is that many models just rate risk at country level. But obviously countries are complex, particularly very large countries. You have the US, India, China, they're made up of many different regions. And so our model provides insights into regional level risk, not just country level risk. And our forecasts have proved rather accurate in where we're going to see an upturn in geopolitical instability. We've been running the model for a decade now, and we've forecast upturns in stability in Ukraine, late 2013, issues in Hong Kong, and then obviously increasing tensions in the Middle East.
I think it's fair to say that geopolitics has gone from something fairly niche on the risk register for many firms to being pretty pervasive and almost omnipresent. So which sectors, which industries are you working with and where you're experiencing highest demand for your advisory services?
Geopolitical risk is topping the agenda for every company, whether they are just working domestically within their home market or internationally, because of obviously the impact geopolitics has on supply chains. So I would say now we are receiving inquiries from companies in almost every sector, be it financial institutions, be it oil and gas companies, be it those working in the tech sector, manufacturing, food and drinks businesses. Every company in the world is impacted either directly or indirectly through their supply chains by geopolitical risk. It is the leading risk now for corporates, and the one that corporates perhaps find the most challenging to manage, because when we look at what's going on in the world, most of the challenges seem to be beyond our control and decided by other actors, be it other governments or other non-state actors. And it can be challenging for CEOs, CFOs of companies to look at how they can take practical steps to manage those risks. And we advise companies on strategies to do that.
And when you work with financial services clients, so, this podcast is primarily aimed at the insurance sector, but if you look at banking, for example, or the investment world, political risk is a big thing. But when I'm used to talking to insurers, this is something that insurers are notorious for. They kind of have their own language for everything, their own products, their own part of the city. Even within the square mile, it's EC3. They're just a world unto themselves. I'm curious kind of for your services that you deliver and advice for clients, just within the other bits of the city, within financial services, how political risk relates to that.
For financial institutions, particularly if we're looking at the banking sector, for example, fund managers, I think political risk used to impact them more if sanctions were imposed on a particular jurisdiction where they had operations and they were forced to withdraw. And obviously that happened with Russia last year. But now we're seeing banks really dragged into the forefront of government's geopolitical risk calculations. I mean, last year, the Democrats secured a pledge from the CEOs of the US largest banks saying that if China was to attack Taiwan, American banks would withdraw immediately from the Chinese market. Now, Russia, when it invaded Ukraine, was the 11th largest economy in the world. US banks did withdraw and are still trying to withdraw because it isn't easy just to pick up and leave when you have those obligations in those markets. And they lost many billions of dollars as a result of that. But the Chinese market is on a completely different scale. We would be talking of tens of millions of dollars were American financial institutions to try to leave those markets.
So, Elizabeth, what sorts of questions are being asked by your institutional clients about the situation in Israel and Gaza?
The main question is, will the conflict expand across the region, which at present, it is a war of words across the region, but it hasn't escalated significantly in military terms. I mean, the Arab-Israeli conflict has changed so much, obviously since 1948, because originally it was the Arab states were supporting Palestine. Now they tend to pay lip service to the Palestinian cause, and it's actually Shia groups that take action supposedly in support of the Palestinian cause. So there's been a very significant change there. And since the last war between Hamas and Israel, a number of Arab states have signed the Abraham Accords with Israel. And they now have diplomatic relations, the UAE being perhaps the most significant country in that regard. And before the Hamas attack, there was talk about a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Well, that's going to be on hold for the moment.
On ice for now, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess politically it's just difficult for politicians in Riyadh and in UAE to say anything that's too sympathetic to the Israelis or start making ties while this is going on.
Exactly. I mean, while this is going on, that isn't possible. I was speaking at an event, it's about 3 months ago now, to a Saudi group of delegates, and Israel-Palestine was discussed, and their view was very much, well, this land is the Palestinians. So for the leadership of Saudi to go against popular sentiment at a time when there's an active conflict between Israel and the Palestinians obviously isn't possible. But I wouldn't say that an agreement between Israel and Saudi will necessarily be off the table for a long time. It really depends how long Israel's activities in Gaza continue, because the Arab states now, they are in favor of normalizing relations with Israel because they can see that it's mutually advantageous, particularly in terms of trade and investment. Israel has the largest economy in the region. The UAE's economy economically is growing. So is Saudi. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, the de facto ruler, is looking to modernize the economy and transition away from hydrocarbons. There could be huge synergies between Israel and the Saudi state, which both governments are interested to pursue. But we do have the ongoing issue of the Palestinians, and that's 5 million people, at least in Gaza and the West Bank.
And the other elephant in the room, or rather it's two large carrier strike groups off the coast of Israel. The Americans
Yes.
We don't know what they're going to do at this point, but the amount of military might that's operating from Cyprus at the moment and out at sea, that's another aspect to the escalatory risk here, right?
For the past year or two, I've been asked so many questions by clients about the demise of American power and how it's now a multipolar world. And I would say it's far more complicated than that. America remains the only superpower able to project its military internationally, which it is demonstrating at the moment. And it remains the only power able to intervene in the Middle East and potentially bring any sense of order or stability. So the carriers are there to deter Iran from becoming either directly involved or involved via Hezbollah militia groups in Lebanon. And actually, to say how things have changed in the region as well, we shouldn't ignore Iran. Iran has and Saudi Arabia sort of normalized or restored, shall we say, diplomatic relations earlier this year. It's very important for both of those countries, and perhaps particularly Iran. Economic sanctions on Iran are crippling. They are unlikely to want to take action which would undermine the new rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. They need that in sort of economic and diplomatic terms. But the longer the situation between Israel and Gaza continues, the more likely external powers are to be dragged in.
Sorry to interrupt the conversation for just a moment, but this is a reminder that you could be advertising in this very spot, and for a fraction of the cost of other media. If you're listening because you're interested in geopolitical risk and in specialty insurance markets, then it's a fair assumption that decision makers at some of your target clients will be listening too. Podcasts are a great way to reach people, direct to the ear of a prospective customer. Email me at david.benyon@gmail.com. My details are on the Political Risk podcast site. I'll make it as simple as I can for you to precision guide your message to your target audience. Thanks a lot, and back to the conversation. You bring some insurance sector expertise to these topics because you were a former partner at a London market insurance broker. So you were responsible for JLT Specialties country risk ratings.
That's right. Yes, I worked in the country and political risk team. And yes, we had a country risk ratings model that used to track risk across the world. I think from the insurance perspective at the moment, obviously the key risk is, will the crisis escalate, and what does that mean for international shipping lanes as well, and potential disruption there.
I assume those ratings would be in flux, but you'd also be in demand, a specialty broker like JLT, some of their lines of business, certainly big lines in the London market, because it's not just political risk, is it?
If we look at how Israel and Iran have interacted with each other over the last few years, there's sort of low-level attacks all the time. Iran might hijack a ship and Israel might launch a small-scale cyber attack on one element of Iran's nuclear program. So these geopolitical escalations affect all lines of business now. There isn't anything that's, I think, isolated from what's going on, because the way states attack each other, yes, it's the military manifestation, it's the bombing we see on the news, but they attack each other in dozens of other ways, which never makes the headlines, which actually can be more destabilizing on a long-term basis.
Or it's difficult to join the dots until after it's potentially too late to do anything about things.
That's right. I mean, other ways in which you can see the insurance market being affected by this is we have a growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. At the moment, Egypt's keeping the Rafah border crossing closed. Whether they continue to do that, we'll see. But we could have more instability, if refugees leave Gaza, the land they claim is Palestine, and go into Egypt and beyond. And that causes instability for neighbouring governments as well. And then that has an impact on the insurance market, because more political and social unrest creates greater instability for businesses operating in those regions. So we see sort of smaller scale protests, don't we, which cause business disruption, and just larger scale pressure on governments to provide basic services.
What roles would you expect Russia and China to play in the scenario of a regional escalation?
In the Middle East, since the creation of Israel in 1940, in fact, beyond, regional escalation has always been about sort of the great powers, wasn't it? So during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US, we had Egypt for a while was aligned with the Soviet Union, and Syria was, and Israel was with America. And then we saw the alignment shift. So a tremendous amount will depend on the position that Russia and China take, because at the moment, they are remaining aloof from the conflict in anything other than perhaps a diplomatic capacity. But if this was to escalate, Russia will not allow Assad to be overthrown in Syria, for example, were Israel to escalate operations against Syria. At the moment, there's no indication that is going to happen. For China, trading routes and open sea lanes around the Gulf are far more important than they are to the Americans now, because China relies on large-scale oil imports from the Gulf states. So China has an interest in stability there. And if the conflict does expand to include Iran or any other states, we'll see severe disruption to shipping in the region. We could say, I think, from this conflict, Russia and potentially China become, if we can use this term, the net beneficiaries. Because since Russia invaded Ukraine in February last year, Western governments have been trying to rally support in the global south against Russia and depicting Russia as the aggressor state in Ukraine. And when Russian military actions have taken out the power and water supply to hundreds of thousands, even millions of Ukrainians, the West have held this up as a violation of international law, and the global south should work with the West in sanctioning Russia. And that has met with a great deal of skepticism, partly going back to the US invasion of Iraq in 2001 and obviously operations in Afghanistan. It undermined US credibility in that space in terms of being even-handed and respecting human rights and the international rules of war. So now we have calls, particularly from sort of certain countries in the global south and also communities in Europe as well, in support of the Palestinians. Russia is benefiting from that because they're holding up, what they're depicting as Israeli bombardment of Palestinian civilians. The water and the power has been turned off. So Russia can now say, well, the West is hypocritical. Actually, this isn't an aggressor conflict in Ukraine. We have genuine concerns about, as Ukrainians' threat to our security. And I think it's really going to complicate in the medium to long term the West's position and diplomatic influence in the global south. And if we look at how Russia-China-US relations play out into the medium term, the West is not the most populous part of the world anymore. Western values aren't in the ascendancy now as they were over the Cold War.
So some of the buzz that's come out of the BRICS with the recent summit, I'm usually quite skeptical about the amount of those countries actually have in common rather than just a PR exercise.
They have very little in common, but opposition to Western power is one element they have in common.
Could this be one of the crisis scenarios that actually might unite them more than most?
I mean, potentially. It's a complex grouping, isn't it? Because China and India, both for different reasons, sort of resent Western power, but India is very keen to have Western, particularly US, support in the event of China acts in a military aggressive way towards them. They're both, China and India are both competing for the same spheres of influence. China has the string of pearls and India is building the necklace of diamonds. So there's huge competition between the two most populous countries in the world there. And while they speak for a huge percentage of the global population, China in economic terms is far more powerful than the other members. So China tends to get its way in terms of decision-making within the bloc. So yes, I think they will become more influential, but given the differences in demographics, economies, and internal stability as well, they're going to find it very challenging to work as a cohesive group as perhaps the EU does.
The consequences, though, on the ground, if you're a Western financial firm, for example, with offices in Saudi, in the UAE, and in Israel itself, I'm trying to work out where that might come back to hit a firm like that, if there is regional escalation.
Well, in Israel, the challenge for businesses at the moment, with at least 360,000 former members of the military mobilized, there is a shortage of workers. So quite a number of businesses are remaining closed. We should remember that internally, Israel has very high caliber intelligence services. So the risk of a terrorist attack is relatively low the majority of time now within Israel. I mean, the Hamas attack was brutal and audacious, but one of the reasons it was able to proceed in the way that it did is that the border between Gaza and Israel wasn't defended. The government of Benjamin Netanyahu isn't going to allow that to happen again. So I think internal security within Israel is very tight. So on a practical level, I don't believe there's a threat to companies from that perspective. Whether if this continues, we do see terrorist attacks against Western interests in Saudi and the UAE. I think they're more likely to happen in Iraq, in more unstable Arab countries than in the big financial centers. The security and intelligence services in those countries are very effective, and they rely on American intelligence as well.
So with some of the potential ways that things might escalate, obviously we hope not, but if I was a decision maker for a large multinational with a footprint within this region, what would be your preemptive or precautionary risk mitigation advice for a company like that with operations not just in Israel but across the wider region?
In the more unstable Arab states with less effective intelligence services and security forces. I would be concerned in the short to medium term about potential terrorist attacks on Western assets. So I would have perhaps the minimum overseas personnel in those countries at present. My concern within Saudi and the UAE would be slightly less because they have more effective security. Within Iraq, we're going to continue to see Iranian attacks on Western assets or US military personnel based there. It sort of comes down to the tit for tat retaliation. Lebanon, even before this, has huge economic problems and is teetering on the brink of being a failed state. So many Western companies are already withdrawn from that market. Obviously, Syria, there's limited Western economic involvement there and has huge political and economic challenges it's dealing with even before this. I think we'll see a growing role for Turkey as negotiator and diplomat. They're working with Qatar, aren't they, to try to secure the release of hostages held by Hamas. So I think we see Turkey's regional profile increasing. I think the situation in that country is slightly easier now for Western investors because President Erdogan, after his election win, is following slightly more orthodox monetary and fiscal policies, which is beneficial to investors as well. But I wouldn't be advocating withdrawing completely from the Middle East. I'd minimize personnel in the region and look very carefully about potential for escalation and impact on supply chains and shipping lanes. But with the American aircraft carriers in the region, America is signaling that it will crack down on any external involvement in the conflict. So my view is that escalation is unlikely. I mean, there is concern, isn't there, that Israel may preemptively strike southern Lebanon or Iran.
That's not new, though.
That's not new. I would have thought at the moment Israel is fully occupied with Gaza. So if Iran remains out of this conflict, I think Israel would like to give it a bloody nose because obviously it has been involved in arming Hamas. But it's in the interests of both states not to escalate this into a full-scale war.
Yeah, and of course we don't know what is happening in the back channels of diplomacy between close allies, but I would expect that the Biden administration is probably urging the Israelis to be very, very restrained in what they do with regards to Lebanon and Iran for those reasons.
Yes, I would imagine so. And I'm sure the Americans are talking to the Chinese about this matter as well in back channels and other regional powers.
I think you made a really good point about at the moment, whilst clearly the border between Gaza and the rest of Israel, Israel proper, was porous. Otherwise, Hamas wouldn't have been able to send out gunmen on motorbikes and using hang gliders and whatever other ways they used to cause the atrocities they did that sparked this. But now, as you say, we've got a situation where Gaza, which is not geographically a huge area, is
it's
more or less
very small areas, one of the most densely populated areas in the world.
But it's ringed now by Israeli tanks and fortifications and military camps waiting to go in a sense, or may well have gone in by the time this podcast comes out. But that's a situation that the Israelis will feel, I imagine, very in control of right now. They've got massive amount of boots on the ground on that border. Whereas if they escalate to the areas further north with Lebanon, suddenly they go back into a situation where they're rolling the dice and they have less control over events.
That's right, because you're diverting resources. And at the moment, obviously there's a military presence on the border with Lebanon, but personnel and equipment is amassed on the Gaza border, ready for the ground offensive.
You've already hinted or said that you don't think that escalation will happen. Obviously, it's a risk, and we hope it won't. I think there'll be a lot of people out there who fear this kind of joining of the dots and interrelatedness of what's going on in Israel and potentially could escalate, but also, joining those dots with other geopolitical concerns globally. So obviously what's going on in the past since February 2022 between Russia and Ukraine, conflict there, and in the West's strained relations with China these days. Do you think that is being overcautious? Is that fear-mongering? Or is it just common sense in this kind of new geopolitical era that we find ourselves in to spend some time on joining the dots like this?
It is important for companies to join the dots, and it's important to consider the trends within societies that feed into country risk and then geopolitical risk, because obviously there's a military conflict now going on between Israel and Hamas. And companies are very good at tracking those once we have a hot conflict. But the factors that are going to really shape the geopolitical landscape in the coming years are demographic change. We have an aging population. It's going to be access to resources. Okay, we've always competed over hydrocarbon resources, but now it's going to be water, isn't it? And the new metals and minerals that we need for this green transition. So the factors I think we need to track are changing. Whether we say the world is more dangerous now from a geopolitical perspective than it was 20 or 30 years ago, I think it's debatable. It feels that it is. We have a war in Europe, and World War I and World War II both started with events in Eastern Europe. So obviously that's hugely concerning, particularly now because Israel, Hamas are diverting attention from Ukraine and potentially funding and arming Ukraine. That's going to be a different dynamic. But we can look at it the other way. China has significant internal challenges. It has an aging population. It is economically weaker than it was before the pandemic. I mean, the economy was contracting prior to that. It has huge structural issues. And Russia has lost about half of its ground forces in Ukraine. So in terms of great powers being able to wage war, perhaps we could say the odds of that have diminished slightly, unless we're looking at nuclear confrontation, which obviously is in everyone's interest to avoid. So perhaps the headlines make it seem more frightening than the reality, depending where you sit in the world.
Yeah, I think there's more attention being paid to when people look back at historical parallels. And I think these days it's the early 1900s, it's the years before the First World War that start to look relevant in terms of history rhyming. It does feel like there's a things getting out of hand vibe politically, in which unintended consequences are always something that, you don't know how things are going to develop. And it feels like now that there are so many fires burning in different parts of the globe that there's more scope for things to spiral out of control.
I think states, be they superpowers or be they smaller states like Iran and Israel, they think they can manage these proxy conflicts and the tit for tat retaliation at a low level, but suddenly it spirals out of control. And I think that there is a definite risk of that happening at the moment. It needs to be effectively managed.
So that's it for another episode. Please join for the next one, already in production, which is going to be focused on the threat of a crisis between China and Taiwan. So please stay tuned, follow, like, and subscribe. You've been listening to the Political Risk Podcast, hosted by me, David Benyon. My guest this time was Elizabeth Stevens of Geopolitical Risk Advisory. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin provided the music.